Welcome to Echoes of Heresy. I'm Andy Altschuler, and I invite you to join me on a journey through the shadowed margins of belief. This podcast isn't about promoting a rebellion for its own sake, nor it is about criticizing any point of view. It's about exploring the shifting boundaries between the accepted and the rejected, the sacred and the condemned. For years, I've been fascinated by the doctrines that defy consensus, the spiritual experiments, theological misfits, and forgotten sects that history has often tried to silence or sanitize. This show is the result of this long study and quiet obsession. I envision this podcast as a platform for non-academic but evidence-based exploration of ideas seen as heterodox or divergent, as well as individuals and groups of people who produced these ideas across various cultures, places, and times. We will trace how these ideas reverberate through history, lead interaction between people, and ultimately shape the perception of reality. In this first episode, we'll step back and ask, why heresy? And what is heresy? What do we gain by studying the margins of belief, and how can we trace their echoes across history? This episode is a map of the terrain we'll travel. I'm Andy Altschuler, and this is Echoes of Heresy, a podcast about spiritual dissent and divergent beliefs across time and tradition. Before we begin, a quick, or maybe not so quick note on language. It is important to say that words like heresy and orthodoxy are not neutral. They carry the weight of institutional judgment, power struggles, and theological boundaries that often shifted over time. In this podcast, I use these terms descriptively, not prescriptively. Not to pass judgment, but to explore how ideas were received, resisted, or redefined. I recognize that for some listeners, these topics may touch on deeply held beliefs. My aim isn't to dismiss the sacred, but to understand how different visions of the sacred have collided, evolved, and sometimes been silenced. I'm not here to pass moral verdict or take sides. This isn't about declaring who was right or who was wrong, who is good and who is bad. My goal is simply to trace the history of beliefs that have diverged from the mainstream, whether for political, social, or spiritual reasons, and to show you why they mattered. I'll ground each story in primary texts and current scholarship, and I'll be candid about the reliability of my sources. But you'll never hear me label anyone a true or false prophet. I'm not claiming to possess any special knowledge or reveal any hidden truths. I will go as careful as I can through the primary and secondary sources, highlight the details that I find curious, deserving due attention, or crucial for understanding of certain phenomena or historic events. I sincerely hope that my research will help listeners who are also interested in this fascinating subject to come to their own conclusions in their historical, philosophical, or spiritual search. This is an independent project driven by curiosity and respect for all traditions. I welcome your suggestions, feedback, and questions, and ask only for a spirit of open-minded dialogue. Let's explore these hidden corners of belief together, without agenda or judgment. Since the dawn of organized religion, humans have tried to define and defend the sacred, and yet history reveals that the sacred resists confinement. Even in the most regulated societies, belief has overflowed its borders. Consider the Egyptian god Set, an embodiment of chaos and desert storms, foreignness and disruption, reviled in some periods, revered in others, his cult survived precisely because the cosmos needed an edge. Or take Loki, the Norse trickster, bound yet necessary, disruptive but never irrelevant, a god who reminds us that destruction can precede renewal. Curiously enough, even at times when gods like Set and Loki were demonized, reviled, and feared, they were never entirely erased. They retained sacred spaces, dedicated priesthoods, and specific rites to approach them. These figures attracted particular individuals or groups, some in moments of crisis or transformation, others as lifelong devotees. In myth and ritual, they became conduits for truths that conventional religion struggled to contain. This dynamic of attraction to the feared or forbidden echoes ancient shamanic traditions. In many cultures, there is a tension between the community-rooted day-to-day shaman, healer, guide, ritual leader, and the outcast sorcerer or wandering magician. The latter often broke taboos, lived on the edges, but was still sought after in moments of deep need. Both roles served the sacred, though in radically different ways, one upholding order, the other embodying its shadow. Myths and rites of ancient Greece evidently articulate this paradox through stories of titans and gods, agents of chaos and order, who, by the way, often swap their respective roles. Friedrich Nietzsche, in The Birth of Tragedy, saw the tension between the Apollonian and the Dionysian as foundational to Greek culture. The Apollonian dream world of beauty and Dionysian world of intoxication and madness are art siblings, mutually enhancing each other, driven by the same artistic impulse. The ordered and the chaotic, the rational and the ecstatic, each needed the other to express the fullness of the sacred. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the mystery cults, Dionysian, Orphic, Eleusinian, that operated beneath the polished marble of the city-states. Their rites were secret, perhaps transgressive, and likely ecstatic. To be initiated was to cross a threshold into a vision of reality withheld from the masses. Mircea Eliade wrote, "Initiation always means a new birth, new existential situation brought about by revelation of the sacred." These cults were not deviations, they were essential, spiritual laboratories for alternate cosmologies and inner transformation. We glimpse some of these dynamics even in the teachings of pre-Socratic philosophers, whose metaphysical insights often resonate with the language of initiation and cosmic rupture. These examples, from shamans to philosophers, show that spiritual life was never fully at peace with itself. Always there were undercurrents. And here comes the question, why do people stray beyond the sanctioned path? Sometimes the answer lies in the psyche. There is something deeply human in the pursuit of the forbidden, not out of rebellion alone, but in search of something higher, a deeper truth, a sharper flame. In the Talmudic tradition, a famous midrash in the treatise known as Bereshit Rabbah recounts the young Abraham smashing the idols in his father's shop. When asked who did it, Abraham blames the largest idol, claiming it destroyed the others in a quarrel. His father protests, saying that idols are lifeless. Abraham replies, "Let your ears hear what your mouth is saying." This act of iconoclasm is not driven by nihilism, but by a vision of the divine that transcended image and form. It's a moment of rupture, not just against external authority, but against inherited patterns of thought. Søren Kierkegaard was fascinated by the story of Abraham, not just the iconoclast of Midrash, but the patriarch of Genesis, who prepared to sacrifice his own son in obedience to a divine command. Kierkegaard saw in Abraham the ultimate example of the knight of faith, someone who makes a leap beyond the ethical into the absurd. To truly become oneself, one must leap beyond convention, an act that often appears transgressive or heretical to society. From a psychological perspective, thinkers in the Jungian tradition have seen acts of transgression as necessary steps in individuation, the process by which a person integrates their unconscious shadow and becomes whole. As Jung himself wrote, the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. Confronting and integrating these darker or rejected aspects often requires breaking social or religious taboos. Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Jung's closest collaborators, observed, "The shadow is not necessarily always an opponent. In fact, he is often the guide to the deepest springs of vitality." In this sense, the act of heresy might be not a descent into chaos, but a passage towards a more integrated and authentic spiritual identity, both of an individual and a society. Socrates was condemned for introducing new daimonia, for corrupting the youth. In Athens, even a polytheistic society had its orthodoxy, a set of shared gods, rituals, and civic virtues that held the polis together. Socrates' daimonion wasn't one of the city's familiar deities, but an inner voice he described as a divine sign. To many Athenians, this sounded like inventing a god of his own, undermining Zeus, Athena, and the rest. His habit of grilling young citizens in the marketplace, exposing the gaps between their confident claims and the city's accepted wisdom, felt destabilizing, and so was cast as corruption. But what Socrates offered wasn't mere rebellion or nihilism, but radical inquiry as a spiritual practice. By turning attention inward, testing beliefs against reason and conscience, he challenged the idea that religion was only about external rituals or inherited myths. As he famously declared in Plato's Apology, the unexamined life is not worth living. For Socrates, the path to the divine lay in honest self-examination, not blind repetition of tradition. This reminds us that heterodoxy, beliefs or practices outside the sanctioned norm, is not unique to monotheism. Even in a world of many gods, Socrates' heretical spirituality shows how every religious framework, polytheistic, monotheistic, or atheistic, produces its own boundaries and underground currents. His legacy as a spiritual provocateur lies in proving that questioning orthodoxy can itself be a sacred act. The Gnostics went further. To them, the world itself was a flawed creation, and salvation lay in gnosis, hidden knowledge that redefined divinity and denied the legitimacy of earthly powers. Their vision often reassessed the villains of tradition. The serpent of Eden became a bringer of knowledge, not sin. Cain, a bearer of divine spark in defiance of an unjust world. Judas, not a traitor, but an initiate, playing a necessary role in the cosmic drama. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the male and the female one and the same, so that the male not be male, nor the female female, then will you enter the kingdom." This is not a call to destruction, but to integration, a dissolving of binaries, an embrace of paradox. Heresy in this frame becomes not a rift, but a reunification of that which the official doctrines tried to keep apart. The Thunder-Perfect Mind, one of the most enigmatic Gnostic texts, speaks in paradoxes. I am the whore and the Holy One, I am the bride and the bridegroom. In these contradictions, it offers a vision of wholeness through reconciliation of opposites, a theme echoed across heterodox mysticism. Heresy in this frame is not fragmentation, but integration. Such texts reveal a yearning for a nuanced reality, not divided into good and evil, orthodox and false, but layered, paradoxical, alive. And now a little bit of etymology. English word heresy comes from ancient Greek word hairesis, meaning choice or point of view. In some contexts, it meant just a school of thought. Paul the Apostle uses this word in his epistle to Corinthians, quote, "No doubt there have to be differences among you to show which of you have God's approval." End quote. He used that word to define differences of opinion of factions within the early Christian community. Thus, he made a groundwork for its later use in the Christian discourse. From the quoted Paul's statement and some other related passages in the New Testament, it follows that there essentially cannot be orthodoxy as such without heresy. So what is heresy if not a shadow cast by orthodoxy? Orthodoxy often defines itself retroactively, not by inherent truth, but by what it successfully excludes. The Arians, Nestorians, Donatists, Monophysites, all part of early Christianity's fractal growth, each eventually deemed deviant. In Judaism, messianic expectations birthed movements like Bar Kokhba revolt, and, centuries later, the dramatic rise and fall of Shabbatai Tzvi. Well, and early Christianity itself may be seen through this lens. In Islam, groups like Ghulat pushed theology into mystical and often shocking territory, elevating imams to divine status, fusing philosophy with passion. And the problem of application of pure monotheism was never fully resolved if we look at the development of Islamic theology in historic perspective. So who defines orthodoxy? And when? The line between orthodoxy and heresy is not always theological. It is political, linguistic, and institutional. A boundary that appears solid in one era may be porous in another. It is often a thin line, drawn in ink, but contested in blood. Take, for instance, the controversy surrounding hesychasm. In 14th century Byzantium, Gregory Palamas, a monk of Mount Athos, defended the practice of contemplative stillness and the experience of uncreated light, a direct, mystical encounter with the divine. His teachings were fiercely opposed by Barlaam of Calabria, who saw them as irrational and dangerously mystical. For a time, it wasn't clear whether Palamas' ideas would be condemned as heretical, yet eventually his vision was absorbed into Eastern Orthodox doctrine. What once stood on the edge of orthodoxy became a cornerstone of it. Such moments remind us, today's heresy may be tomorrow's tradition. The boundary between exclusion and embrace is always under negotiation. Heresy is often a mirror, distorted or clear, of the norm. But mirrors are dangerous things, especially for institutions built on authority. And this brings us to the deeper issue: control. Who holds the power to label an idea as dangerous, to suppress a vision, to rewrite the map of spiritual legitimacy? The tension between revelation and regulation lies at the heart of every religious tradition, and where there is tension, there is also resistance. Control operates on many levels: doctrinal, determining what may be said about the divine; ritual, who may speak and how; textual, which scriptures are preserved, edited, or declared apocryphal; and perhaps most powerfully, historical, deciding what stories are remembered and which are erased. But even under such constraints, spiritual life rarely stands confined. It finds other channels. One such channel is what has often been called the faith of the philosophers, a tradition too abstract, too nuanced, or too speculative to fit within official orthodoxy. From the ancient Neoplatonists to the Islamic philosopher, from medieval Jewish Kabbalists to Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart, thinkers across traditions explored metaphysics that pushed beyond dogma. Neoplatonism, in particular, became a kind of shared theological language, a framework that subtly bridged Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and even reinterpreted pagan cosmologies. Sometimes these ideas ran parallel to orthodoxy, sometimes they were woven carefully within it. At other times, they stood in quiet but profound tension against it. Where institutional religion sought clarity and obedience, the philosophical current often demanded contemplation, paradox, and the courage to think beyond appearances. As Plotinus wrote, "Withdraw into yourself and look, and if you do not find yourself beautiful yet, act as does the creator of a statue." This wasn't dogma, it was spiritual craftsmanship. At the opposite end of the spectrum, not among the elite, but in village homes and roadside shrines, we find folk religion, a parallel current of belief that lived beneath or beside orthodoxy. Here saints blended with older spirits. Official liturgies coexisted with spells, charms, and seasonal rites. The Virgin Mary was venerated in terms that sometimes echoed ancient goddesses. Pagan festivals were baptized, but not erased. Folk religion was rarely heretical in the formal sense. It wasn't written down, debated, or systematized, but it posed its own challenge, a spiritual grammar that refused to be standardized. Then there is esotericism, hidden knowledge for the initiated. Whether in hermetic texts, alchemical symbolism, or in mystical numerologies, esotericism claimed a deeper layer of truth beneath the surface. It played a long game with authority, often outwardly conforming while inwardly reshaping the very meaning of scripture, symbol, or sacrament. In some periods, these traditions served as philosophical laboratories for elite seekers. In others, they offered refuge for the spiritually displaced. And sometimes, resistance was neither open nor abstract, but covert. Crypto-belief emerged wherever religious uniformity was violently imposed. The crypto-Jews of Iberia maintained ancestral rites behind closed doors under threat of inquisition. Crypto-Muslims in Christian Spain, crypto-Christians in Ottoman lands, and crypto-pagans in Christianizing Europe all developed elaborate systems of code, silence, and secret ritual to preserve forbidden faiths. These hidden practices didn't simply resist, they evolved. They gave rise to syncretisms, new hybrid theologies, and the form of double consciousness, one face for the world, another for the sacred within. Even as religious authorities policed the boundaries of belief, they could never fully contain it. Ideas wandered, symbols bled into each other, worship adapted. The impulse toward control reveals the deeper fear within institutions that the divine may be too wild to be tamed. And so the history of heresy is also a history of institutional anxiety, an effort to contain the uncontainable. But heterodoxy is not only an act of resistance, it is often a signal. Heretics are not always lone rebels, nor simply reactionaries. Sometimes they are symptoms of a deeper transformation underway in a culture. Agents, yes, but also signs. As Oswald Spengler argued in The Decline of the West, civilizations are not static, but organic, each moving through a cycle of birth, growth, maturity, and decay. When a culture begins to ossify, the decisive battle is not fought on the front, but in the interior. Heresies erupt not just because individuals lose faith in dogma, but because the cultural soil itself has changed. The heretic, in this light, may be canary in the theological coal mine or the prophet of a new age. Their ideas do not exist in isolation, but as part of broader historical forces, social upheavals, intellectual revolutions, silent shifts in collective longing. They are fault lines through which the future leaks. This is especially visible in moments of syncretism, when cultures, empires, and traditions meet, blend, and reshape one another. The Greek magical papyri offer a vivid example. Egyptian deities invoked with Greek formulae, Jewish divine names inscribed alongside Hermetic incantations, a spiritual crossroads encoded in ritual. Or consider Solomonic magic, which fuses biblical figures with Islamic jinn lore, Christian angelology, and Greco-Roman planetary mysticism, a living archive of entangled traditions transmitted through secret texts and guarded chains of knowledge. Even the Roman Empire, so often remembered for its conquests and law, was spiritually a kind of free market of metaphysical ideas. Mystery cults, imported deities, Eastern savior figures, philosophical schools, and esoteric rites competed and coexisted in the same urban neighborhoods. Orthodoxy, if it existed at all, was fluid and often regional. These currents remind us that belief does not move in straight lines. It loops, adapts, and reappears in new clothing. And this is why studying heterodoxy historically and cross-culturally matters so deeply. Heresy is not a fixed category. What was condemned in one era is canonized in another. What seemed subversive in one place may be orthodox just across the border. The Cathars of southern France and the Bogomils of the Balkans shared striking theological parallels, but their stories unfolded under different pressures. The Sufi mystic Hallaj was executed in Baghdad for proclaiming, "I am the truth." But similar ecstatic expressions became central to Persian poetry. The teachings of Spinoza, once banned and reviled, are now foundational in modern philosophy. To truly understand heresy, we must treat it not as failure, but as part of belief's living dialectic, its shadow, its frontier, its challenge, and its test, a prism through which the sacred reveals more of itself. So why study heresy? Not to glorify dissent for its own sake, not to romanticize rebellion, but to listen carefully to the voices that once unsettled the world. Because in those voices, we sometimes hear echoes of questions still unanswered, desires still burning, truths still unfolding. Heresy is not the opposite of faith. It is what happens when faith is on the move. What then is heresy? It is a question mark scrawled in the margins of holy texts, a whisper behind the chant, a candle lit in a forbidden cave. Heresy is the belief that there might be more, that the sacred is not exhausted by what is sanctioned, not confined to what has been canonized. It is tempting to think of orthodoxy as a fortress and heresy as its enemy. But history shows a more intricate truth. Heresy often becomes the testing ground for faith's renewal, its evolution, even its survival. Without tension, there is no depth. Without divergence, no dialogue. Each heretical voice we'll explore in this series speaks not only from the past, but to the present. These stories are not dead. Their questions remain unresolved. The dilemmas they pose about authority, truth, transcendence, and the limits of the human spirit still press on us. In this podcast series, we will move through time and across traditions. We will look into Gnostic Gospels, trace the stories of various Persian dualists, obscure sects from various parts of the world. We will try to understand long-forgotten or currently burning theological controversies. We will meet visionaries who saw too much, and the philosophers whose abstractions stirred suspicion. We won't always find answers, but we'll listen deeply and follow the echoes. This has been the first and introductory episode of Echoes of Heresy, where I attempted to lay out the vision and conceptual drive behind this podcast series. If this episode sparked questions, disagreements, or reflections, I want to hear them. You can reach me directly at echoesofheresy@gmail.com. Whether you're a scholar, seeker, skeptic, or just heretically curious, your voice is welcome here. Echoes of Heresy is a space for dialogue, and your thoughts help shape its future. If you enjoyed the episode, consider sharing it, rating it on your podcast app, or simply telling a friend. Word of mouth means more than algorithms ever could. Each following episode will focus on a particular movement or sect, theological concept or trend, heterodox thinker or strain of thinkers. This will be not only examples of heterodoxy as such, but also systems of belief that are not easy to classify, label, or put into a box. For instance, The very next story of ours will be about the Hypsisterians, pagan monotheists of late antiquity. Who were they, and what do we actually know about them? After that, we'll turn to Bardesan of Edessa, early Christian philosopher and astrologer, and explore his life, ideas, and legacy. Then we'll travel to early medieval Persia to trace the rise and fall of the Kuramite movement and see how and why their story still echoes in modern political narratives. And that's only the beginning. There are lots of stories I want to share with you, and I hope they will be as interesting for you as they are for me. I'm Andy Altshuler. Thank you for listening and for joining me on this journey.